This sermon is in 3 acts. Act 1, the prologue. What is a Baptist? I have a soft spot in my heart for otherwise good people who are remembered wrongly by history. And I think that this comes from my personal fascination with how often the opposite appears to be the case. Absolutely terrible people who are remembered as heroes. I grew up in the halcyon days of the 1990s. Oh, that glorious age of yore. Time before time. It was true in many ways because I grew up before the internet really got going, and everything after that got pushed onto social media and shared with the entire human race. We didn't have that. We just had books and grown-ups. That was it. And when I was a child, I was still taught how to use the Dewey Decimal System and read things in books, and we didn't really have that internet. But in the 1990s was a season of tremendous change in the way in which history is taught to children in America. And much of this change took place while I was a child being taught history in America. When I was a small boy in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, we learned the facts, right? Just the facts. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that's right, there you go. In 1493, Columbus sailed the deep blue sea. Yes, okay, we didn't learn that part. That's all right. Let's say something else. Something, ships of 3, I think, I don't know. And I learned that Columbus did a lot of other things. He was a hero. He discovered America. And he proved that the earth was round. Oh, those silly Europeans. They all thought he would sail off the edge of a cliff. But nope, not Columbus. And he had 3 boats, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Nope, there's the bell. It's time for recess. Okay, go play on the giant wooden playground and fill your sneakers up with pea gravel. And that was the 90s. And then something happened. Right? Something happened. And it's a bit later. We'll fast forward now. It's 5th grade. History class, Columbus. And now I'm learning some new stuff. I'm hearing words I hadn't heard before. I'm learning a new word. I'm learning the word genocide. There was a genocide. And I'm learning that Columbus didn't discover anything. He encountered things, and then he stole them. He promised them to the rulers of Spain, the gold, the spices, and then the people. And I learned about Columbus and slavery. Many of the people who grew up in my generation memorized the facts in order to pass the test. But I memorized the facts because I was raised by college professors, and I knew that they would want to review these so-called facts I'd been learning in school. And I remember asking my father about this business with Columbus. I thought he was a hero. We named a whole day after him. I thank God that my father never spoke down to me. He was not exactly what I would call a gentle or patient person, but he never dismissed me or my questions, and he was very direct and factual. And I remember him teaching me that history, what we call history today, is not a list of facts about what happened, but rather history is a perspective written by one group of people. And from the perspective of the powerful people in Europe, and then to another, perhaps lesser extent, the Roman Catholic Church, Columbus was a hero. However, from the perspective of the 6 million Native Americans who died in the ensuing genocide, he was the first of many monsters to come. And so I looked at him and I asked, as any normal child would, well, Dad, then what's our perspective? And I know what he said because it's etched into my brain. It's in the same spot where I go when I need to remember how to tie a half Windsor knot or sharpen a chainsaw blade or deploy the Oxford comma. When I asked him, what's our perspective? He replied, of course, our perspective is that you think for yourself. Well, what's next? Are they going to teach us that Thomas Edison wasn't a brilliant inventor? That John Wayne hated horses? It's crazy. Oh, perspective. That's the thing about history. As much as we want history to be a simple ledger upon which are written down the material facts of reality, like a grocery receipt of human events, it is, and it will only ever be, a matter of perspective. And so then later, a very kind middle school teacher gave me a dog-eared copy of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, and we were off to the races. So what is our perspective of the earliest days of the Fountain Street Church? For those of you who are new here, the Fountain Street Church of Grand Rapids, Michigan, this place, this thing that we are about, has existed in some way, shape, or form since about 1823, about 202 years. And it was once known as the Fountain Street Baptist Church. It was once also known as the First Baptist Church of Grand Rapids. Today it is known as the Fountain Street Church. But those earliest people, they were Baptists. And they knew that they were Baptists because everyone around them told them so. You've got to understand that in the 19th century, and before the 19th century, the word Baptist was used to describe a lot of people. What is a Baptist? Well, a Baptist in the context of the history of the United States is a nonconformist, a people who are viewed as so fiercely independent that they need to be isolated, quarantined. By God, give them their own church. Put them all in there so they leave us alone, won't cause problems. And I know this because I am not a Baptist. As a certified and registered non-Baptist, in my mind, a Baptist is a person who won't baptize babies. I think to myself, it's funny that they call themselves Baptists then. But they won't do this. They don't sprinkle the babies because they tell me babies lack the ability to freely consent to their own baptism, and damned if that isn't really important to Baptists. It doesn't matter if I stand firm on the rock of my own tradition and shout until I'm blue in the face that infant baptism isn't a test of the baby's faith, that infant baptism is not forcing babies into a religion that they didn't choose. It doesn't matter if I scream and shout that infant baptism is about the community of adults who are caring for the baby. It doesn't matter that I promise to include that old catechism confirmation clause at the end that officially affirms the baby's own agency and individual freedom to affirm their baptism when they're old enough to care about it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the Baptists because they say, I'm a baptizer of babies. You ought not sign babies up for things that they didn't agree to ahead of time. And I can respect that. And it's such a minor point. It is such a minor point. Because being a Baptist is about infinitely more than that. It's perspective. As a non-Baptist, that's my perspective. Baptists historically affirm what they call the four fragile freedoms. There's four of them, and they're fragile, as we're about to learn. It is these four freedoms, more than anything else, I think, that created such a tremendous history of intolerance against Baptists on the part of everybody else. The four freedoms. First, Bible freedom, the complete and total freedom of the individual to read and interpret the Bible as they see fit. Second, church freedom, the freedom of the individual church to organize itself independently, democratically, however it sees fit. Third, religious freedom, freedom of religion, freedom for religion, and freedom from religion. The freedom to worship in whatever manner they choose, with whomever they choose, free from the intervention of the state or anyone else. And fourth, soul freedom, the freedom and responsibility of every person to relate to God without the imposition of creed or control by the government or clergy. And if you want to really understand this business of the four freedoms, you need to listen to a sermon that was given from this pulpit by the most recent Baptist minister of this church, the Reverend Christopher Rowe, on September 26th, 2021. A sermon entitled, Cozying Up to Our History. That's a very Chris Rowe title for a sermon. I love that. I will put a link to that sermon in the YouTube description of this sermon, and then you ought to give it a listen because Reverend Rowe does a far, far better job at this than I could ever hope to do. Baptists are at the very root of this thing, and Baptists were viewed as outsiders by everyone who wasn't a Baptist, and that was as true 200 years ago of the first Baptists as it is today of this free and independent church in Grand Rapids. My God, just this very morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone that some beloved child of God had left us a 1-star review on Google. Because, and I quote, don't let the word church fool you, nothing about this place is Christian, end quote. Thank you, Mr. Giacolone. If you didn't want your name included in the sermon, you ought to have kept your thoughts to yourself. And you're also wrong. I can't make this stuff up. Now, hang on a second. You say, wait a minute, back up. You said 202 years. You just said this place is 202 years old. I thought this place just celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2019. How does that math work? It works based on your perspective. If you place the founding of the Fountain Street Church in the year 1849, and I think that's a strong case to be made for that date. I mean, they chiseled it into the cornerstone. Then yes, the church is 154 years old. In 1849, 154 years ago, two different Baptist churches that were themselves splitters from each other finally got over their differences and hired a minister to unite them into one single church again, and they bought some land at the corner of Bostwick and Fountain Street, and they went ahead and hired that new minister, and they called themselves the Fountain Street Baptist Church. All right. Why do I say, then, that the church is 202 years old? Does it matter? Who cares? I do. I care, because history matters. It's important. Fine. What was going on then with those Grand Rapids Baptists for those first 30 years? Dannison, those 30 years of prehistory. Oh, a hell of a lot. Which brings us to Act 2, the mission. 202 years ago, in 1823, the first, quote, permanent European American settler, end quote, arrived on the banks of the Grand River and set up shop. And he was a Baptist missionary named Isaac McCoy. At that time, the Grand River was named Awashtanog, or faraway waters. And it was home to roughly 1,000 Ottawa families who farmed its banks and who had been living here themselves for over 200 years before that first Baptist arrived. When this Baptist missionary arrived, the people here were under the leadership of a man named Nawagagishik. Today, you know him as Chief Noonday. The Ottawa people, at the point that McCoy arrived, had been living there significantly longer than white people have been living in Grand Rapids today. So if you ask them, and to be clear, you can ask them, when did this business of this church known as Fountain Street get started? You would probably get an answer that aligns more closely with that earlier date. A lot of church splitting and rejoining doesn't really matter when it all kicked off with a single guy. Baptist missionary McCoy set up shop, and what followed then was 40 years 30 to 40 years involving at least 4 different Baptist churches, setting up, getting into arguments, splitting, dying, being resurrected, and a great many other things, until at last, in 1849, they calmed down a little bit and settled down here at this spot. And they called a minister to the church named Samuel Graves. All right, now 2 quick asides, footnotes to this 19th century business. First, I am honor-bound to mention that McCoy, that Baptist, was not the only missionary who set up shop on the banks of the Grand River. 10 years later, in 1833, a Roman Catholic missionary named Frederick Baraga came to this area and built St. Mary's Mission. And then Father Andrew Wyszowski was the first priest assigned to that mission. The 2 missions were quite different. The Baptist mission, McCoy's mission, was by almost all accounts a total failure. According to the best records that I have, over the course of the first 10 years of the operation of that mission, the Baptist missionaries report converting a grand total of 9 people. The Roman Catholics, on the other hand, during their first year of operation, converted 200, and within that first decade, they'd added another 600. The difference, I think, was in their approach. The Roman Catholics built schools and hospitals and gave sacrificially to that community around them, and the Baptists preached. There's a lesson in that. The second footnote that I've got to make real quick is for the benefit of my own kith and kin, who, upon hearing this sermon, will give me grief for not mentioning our own family patriarch, the great Rix Robinson. What's all this business with Isaac McCoy and these Baptists? Well, Rix Robinson was the first white man hereabout. And I am indeed, by way of some twists and turns, the 7th generation of my family that's lived here in this area, and we are descended from that man, from that fur-trading politician. But Rix Robinson wasn't the founder of Grand Rapids. He was really the founder of Ada and the founder of Kent County. And frankly, he bought his fur post from Madeleine Laframboise. So to my kinfolk listening, please, God, do not be concerned. We are not descendant from Baptists. But let us return then to those early Baptists, the proto-Fountain Streeters, the earliest of our forebears. I don't have time to tell you about everything that occurred between 1823 and 1849. And it was, a lot of it, most of it, deeply unpleasant. It is recorded in those books. But the reality is that the Ottawa people, the people for whom Chief Noonday so fearlessly advocated, the majority of those people were either destroyed or removed. And there is a debt that sits there upon the ledger of our history, and it remains unpaid. And so perhaps you can see why I do care so damned much about the activities of the white Baptists of Grand Rapids prior to the official founding of our church. Because there's a part of me that harbors a suspicion, perhaps unfounded, that by moving the date of our origins from 1823 to 1849, we can wash our hands of those sins. That's heavy. But I need to talk to you about the Baptists of Grand Rapids who set up shop, and it begins with that. In 1849, they came here. They came to Bostwick and Fountain Street. The people who turned over the dirt right here, where we are at this present moment, will move to there. Act 3. It is a fact that many people I have interviewed and many of the books that I've interrogated about the history of this place, Fountain Street Church, they divide the official history of Fountain Street Church, that 1849 to the present, into 2 different segments. I'm talking about that standard 150-year history. And the first period, they'll say, is from 1849 to about maybe 1890 or 1900. And the second period is then from that 1890 forward. And that there were 2 different kinds of churches, they might say. Before 1890, Fountain Street was hellfire and damnation. biblical literalists, these backward conservative fundamentalists, Baptists. And then in 1890, things changed. 1890 forward, that's the liberal era, liberal religion. And some of them will put that dividing line between these two identities found in the identity of the minister, Reverend John L. Jackson. And they'll read the sermons of Jackson and his writings in the mid-1890s, and what's it? It says he's pro-labor unions, and he is a socialist, and he advocates for modernism and science. Some of them will give more credit to, and they'll struggle with that a bit because he was also a biblical literalist, and that he believed the Bible literally advocated for those things. And then some will say, no, it's the minister that came after Jackson. It was J. Herman Randall, 1896. Randall preached that the Bible was not as authoritative, but rather encouraged deeper questions. And Randall rejected substitutionary atonement, and he rejected literalism. Or maybe it wasn't Randall, and maybe it must have been the fellow that came after him. It was Alfred Wishart in 1906. I mean, that guy was a flaming liberal. Maybe it was all three of them working in cahoots, They all graduated from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Maybe that was it, Chicago. But there was a change. They can seem to agree on this. They agree that there was a change. I just don't know. At some point in the early days of the official Fountain Street Church, that history, they contend that the church was conservative and fundamentalist and rigid and followed Orthodox Christianity. And then something happened and the church became a bastion of free thought and liberalism and questioning, because for God's sakes, those people were Baptists. And we all know what Baptists are like, don't we? Beloved kinfolk, I am not a Baptist. And I do not pretend to be a Baptist, and I have never been a Baptist. My family history is a lot of things, up to and including the Ashkenazi Jews and more Methodists than I'm comfortable with. And in my own ministry, if I'm anything at all, I'm a Congregationalist, I suppose, which means a pilgrim. I draw my theology from men wearing wigs with buckles on their hats and writing angry letters to the King of England. A Baptist I ain't, but I have studied a lot of church history and a lot of American history. And while the history of the church in America is absolutely filled with scoundrels and creeps and sociopaths, it also has within it more than a few honest-to-God heroes and martyrs for ethical causes greater than themselves. And a lot, and I mean a lot, of these really, really good and holy rebels were Baptists. And I can start wherever I want. But what the hell? Let's start with John Bunyan, that radical anti-monarchist preacher who wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, the book that's depicted in that stained glass window right there. John Bunyan, who sat in an English prison cell for 12 years in the 1660s because he refused to bend the knee over freedom of speech. John Bunyan, the radical, the Baptist. And then we can jump across the ocean to my own spiritual ancestors, the damned Puritans who set up shop in New England and immediately passed laws forbidding two very specific flavors of Christians. All of this from the Pilgrim people fleeing monarchy, pursuing freedom of thought and freedom of religion. But no, there were two religions that were too radical, too dangerous. There were two flavors that would get you tried and hanged in the colonies: the Quakers and the Baptists. And when these same Pilgrim people, Congregationalists, founded Harvard University, which we still own, a new, shining bastion of education and free thinking. Harvard University, they chose as the first president of Harvard University the great titan of scholarship, Henry Dunster. They shipped him over from Cambridge to run the place, which he did for over a decade, until around 1650, it was discovered, to the absolute horror of the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony, that the president of Harvard University was, God Almighty, a Baptist. A Baptist! Because Henry Dunster refused to have his infant son baptized, which gave up the game. And the president of Harvard University was literally banished from Massachusetts for the rest of his life. Later on, a man near and dear to my own heart, born in Orange County, Virginia in 1738, name of Elijah Craig. I know this one? The inventor of bourbon. A Baptist minister. On down the road we'll go into the 18th century in the very small, very loud, very unpopular group of people who, out of a sense of moral decency and personal courage, take up the cause of the abolition of human slavery. The abolitionists, we call them. Less than 1% of white people in America and over half of all the Baptists. You had publishers of illegal, subversive literature, banned books, people like Martha Gurney, William Fox, Baptists. Radical Southern preachers like John Peck and David Barrow in Kentucky, Baptists. Politicians like Thaddeus Stevens, who was so radical, so far to the left of Abraham Lincoln himself, that they had to have Tommy Lee Jones play him in the movie. A Baptist. Until we get to the one and only, the gentleman I consider to be the great founder of all liberal religious thinking in the last 150 years, the liberal of all liberals, the great father of the social gospel movement and all the social action committees and social justice teams and soup kitchens and shelters, everything that we talk about today when we talk about churches and charity, Walter Rauschenbusch, Baptist. He preached a sermon at Fountain Street Church. March 16th, 1913. It was one of his last. And we can wander on into the 20th century if you want, with suffragettes marching in the streets for women's rights to vote, including women from Fountain Street Church, that Orthodox, conservative, fundamentalist church that gave women full enfranchisement and votes in the congregation 40 years before it was supposedly became a liberal church. The Women's Association of this church today out there marching in the streets with the rest of them, Baptists. Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. But the woman who raised the money for the movement, Helen Barrett Montgomery, was a Baptist. And Helen Barrett Montgomery wasn't just a suffrage activist. In 1921, she was elected as the first woman president of a religious denomination in U.S. history. And guess which denomination had the first woman president? The Northern Baptist Convention. Now, I mainly know Montgomery because she was the first woman to translate the New Testament into English from Greek and have it published. A Baptist. Nanny Burroughs and Sarah Bonwick and Coralie Franklin Cook, tremendous pivotal people in this fight for women's rights in America. All of them were Baptists. And later on, then, into the 20th century, the civil rights movement. Ask yourself why it was so often that the churches that were firebombed by right-wing terror organizations like the KKK in the South and the Black Legion here in Michigan, why were so many of the churches that were attacked, why were they Baptist churches? And the leadership of that movement at every level, Baptists from top to bottom. The titans of the civil rights who were formed in the Baptist church, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Baptist, and ordained and preaching his very first sermon in the fall of 1947 from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Jr., Baptist. And the Reverend Duncan Littlefair, minister of Fountain Street Church for 36 years, 1943 to 1979, he was ordained in the sanctuary of the First Baptist Church of Evanston on Lake Street in 1940. And that church today, incidentally, eventually abandoned its Baptist name, becoming simply Lake Street Church. Today, Lake Street Church, formerly First Baptist Church on Lake Street, describes itself as, quote, a place where you can pursue your own spiritual journey with encouragement and support. Does that sound familiar? Lake Street Church, where Duncan Littlefair was ordained, and wherein on December 12th, 2015, it ordained yet another American Baptist who would go on to become the minister of the Fountain Street Church, the Reverend Christopher Rowe. Baptist. Don't talk to me about conservative Baptists. I'm not even close to a Baptist, and I can't stand having their name dragged through the mud. It is absolutely wild to me that when your average American hears the word Baptist, they immediately think of the most conservative, reactionary, fundamentalist, retrograde theology to ever crawl its way off the back of a chick tract. It's a damned shame, and it is a function of perspective. The same perspective that makes Columbus into a hero can make Baptists into villains. Maybe someday, church, I'll tell you the whole story about Calvinists. Let me share with you my theory in closing. It's only a theory. I wish some of my peers who preach and write on this subject would be a little bit more cautious with their perspectives. Fountain Street wasn't a Baptist church that then became something else. It wasn't a Christian church that stopped being Christian. Frankly, I can say to you now with 1,000,000% confidence, based on nothing more than the last 4 months of interactions that I've had with you folks, if the measure of a Christian were tested by practice rather than creed, there are more Christians at Fountain Street Church than any other church in this city. Fountain Street Church didn't quit the Baptists. The reality is that in the early 20th century, the Baptists in West Michigan quit being Baptists. And they walked away from Fountain Street Church. As it is written in Deuteronomy, for they went and served other gods and worshiped them, gods whom they knew not and whom had not been given unto them. Fountain Street Church never failed to live up to its ideals. And the leadership of this church, with rare exception from 1849 and all the way to 2024, never failed to live up to the foundational freedoms, those 4 freedoms of the Baptists. Wishart and Duncan and the rest of them, they didn't fail to live up to those standards. The rest of the Baptists just simply got bad at being Baptists. God, the first time they tried to throw Fountain Street Church out of the local Baptist association, not denomination, because God forbid they have denominations, Baptists. They had themselves a real heresy trial here in Grand Rapids. Well, now they didn't invite us, naturally, but all these Baptists, they all got together and they read their rule book in order to kick this Fountain Street Church out of the club. And they couldn't find a single point, a single charge against this place that would stick. And so you know what they did? They all quit their own association, and they went and started a new association with new rules that said no Fountain Street allowed. Thus, the Grand Rapids Baptist Association quit itself and went and formed the Grand River Baptist Alliance. I can't make this up. Enough. Now, okay, I'm not a Baptist. I'll baptize any baby in my purview. And I don't trust myself well enough to operate without some governing authority. I like my bosses. I like having a governing board and a conference minister and all this business. But if being a Baptist in Grand Rapids, Michigan means being an outsider, being someone who can find no church to worship in without bending the knee to some man-made authority or creed or king or dogma, and sign me up. Because I am with those people. And I'm with them. I'm with the outsiders, with the others, the ones at no other church but the church of their own free conscience. I'm with the ones who think for themselves. And I don't think that it makes any sense for us today to try to go back to calling ourselves Baptists. I think that word is just shot. Because I think this particular word's lost its relevance. But I do believe that in this place, for 154 years at least, a peculiar people who have always fought with fierce determination to defend their right to think for themselves, a minority of people who have, for different reasons and different seasons of history, always been ushered out of denominational churches. And these people will shine like a city on a hill. They always will. These people have found themselves too passionate for the cold pews of one church, maybe too creative for the unadventurous dogma of some other church, too mystical for the pragmatic liturgies of yet another, and too musical for the leaden hymnals of another, too excitable for the sedate catechisms. These people have always and will always form themselves into an intentional family of outsiders, kindred holding fast to one creed, the freedom of thought, and one doctrine, the way of love. And these people will always exist. And for the generations of the city of Grand Rapids, they have fallen into one another's orbit here at the corner of Bostwick and Fountain Street. And so let Fountain Street Church thrive and grow and throw wide the doors, not as a collective of common-minded insiders, but as a body of the ecclesiology of outsiders. Let it shine and shine and shine. And in the words of Reverend Jackson, those 130 years ago, let new light shine forth perpetual from the hearts of these peculiar people. From the heart, Fountain Street Church, from your heart, because we've got at least another 200 years to go. Amen.